All right. Thank you. So why don't we open it up not only for questions for Ms. Kuhn, but also for both speakers. And I'd like to start first by welcoming Mr. Williams, who is the chair of the Assembly Higher Education Committee. Mr. Williams asked to join this committee, and we welcome Mr. Williams. Thank you for joining us. Ms. Quasbarth, what is your response to the LAO's assertion that the legislature has significantly departed from the traditional budget approach that had been in practice since, I believe, since before 2008?
For decades, as long as most of us can remember.
But the new approach has been...
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Really, when the state hit the most recent recession, it started, again, the situation was so difficult, making some different decisions than in the past.
Okay. So it seems that from what I'm hearing and from what I understand of the LAO's basic assessment, it's that the legislature, it really comes down to an issue of the legislature's oversight and ability to hold the higher education segments accountable for achieving a lot of the statewide priorities that the legislature, through the legislative process and this whole process of public hearings, we identify as our priorities. But it seems that the governor is proposing instead that we give the increases to the higher ed segments without linking the additional funding to specific priorities. What is your response to the governor, the LAO's assessment?
Well, first, I'd like to say that the $142 million general fund increase is specifically linked to not raising tuition levels. So that, again, one of the goals is to maintain affordability. Mm-hmm. But it also comes with that expectation that we've kind of laid out these, state priorities, and that the segments are going to use some of that $142 million to try to achieve better outcomes in those state goals. That's really kind of the meat behind these sustainability plans that the governing boards will have to adopt, because one, it will show if they can't raise tuition, let's say assumption provided by finance are you'll continue to get the funding that's in the long-term plan, another 4% in the next 2 years, and you won't raise tuition and fees. Then the segments would have to show what kind of program cuts would we have to make to live within that. And the hope on the administration's part is that part of that will be achieving greater efficiencies so that they won't have to make as drastic cuts. So while recognizing that they're not going to be able to do all they want to do under the long-term funding plan, we want to see, what kind of achievements they can make on their own. Secondly, as part of the sustainability plans, the segments will have to provide projections on their enrollments. And these are going to be provided in November of 2014. So if the projections provided were unacceptable, if the legislature had issues with them, if the administration had issues with them, we could work that out in the spring process and address those concerns. So I do think there's a lot of responsibility being put on the segments to let us know how they are in fact using these general fund increases. We're not higher education experts in terms of developing course curriculum and what kind of transfer process or whatnot. So we kind of leave it up to the institutions to know how best to provide these different programs. But the other part of the sustainability plans is we've got these 8 or 10 performance measures that were agreed upon by the legislature and the administration, and UC and CSU have to set goals for each of these outcomes. And then they're going to report on them every March in terms of how they've achieved them. So if we see that they've set what we consider an aggressive goal and they're not making any progress toward achieving it in the next year, that could have impacts on the general fund increase they might receive the following year.
But what would happen if, well, okay, so you're saying that if the November performance metrics show that, for example, if enrollment were to go down even as funding for the UCs and the CSUs are going up, that we would consider that unacceptable and make necessary adjustments. But why not do it from the front end? Why not have the legislature identify enrollment growth as a state priority? I think we've been seeing a lot of studies. The Public Policy Institute projects that we need to have over 1 million college degrees by 2025 for our statewide workforce needs. I mean, I think it seems to be recognized across the board that we need to turn out more college graduates, and yet, one of the specific findings that the LAO is making is that, unlike the traditional budgeting, we are not tying increased funding to the specific state priority of increased enrollment. Why not do it on the front end? Why do we have to wait on the back end?
Well, I think that's exactly the issue that the administration is trying to address, is that what we're concerned about is the number of degrees that are obtained by students and how quickly they can obtain those degrees to enter the state's workforce. The issue of, providing additional enrollment funding for CSU, only 16% of their students are able to graduate in 4 years. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, a lot of their students have no intention of graduating in 4 years. They make the decision to work part-time. They have a very different student population than UC, but I'm fairly certain that more than 16% of their students would like to graduate within 4 years. So the governor is proposing, rather than adding new students into the system, let's first get our act together and make sure that the students that are currently enrolled are properly served. And kind of on the natural, if more students are moving through the system more efficiently, that should open up spots for additional funding without even providing additional dollars.
So is the governor proposing to move away from the master plan goals of, it's my understanding that in the case of CSU, if we were to pursue the master plan goal of admitting the top 33% of high school graduates, that we would have admitted more than 20,000 students, more than 20,000 California residents would have had an opportunity to attend a Cal State University. So, I appreciate that it's a balancing act. It's not an either-or question that, if we get more kids to graduate on time, that'll open up spaces for more students. But at the same time, we need to get more students the opportunity to get in the door first so that they can have that opportunity to work toward graduation. It seems to me that rather than just focusing exclusively on the transfer and graduation rates, we also need to be looking at specifically enrollment targets.
The administration is kind of looking at the master plan and the demographics of the state today compared to 1960 when the master plan was put into place are very different. So we're not making, any recommendations now in terms of are those 12.5% and 1/3 targets for UC and CSU still applicable, or is that what we should be gearing at? But again, I just think, the governor's made it quite clear that his preference is making sure that CSU doesn't enroll students that can't graduate in a timely manner.
Okay. Mr. Chavez.
I'd like to follow up on that discussion. One of the I think the important thing is that you're focusing on outcomes, not inputs. You want the outcomes, and you're actually measuring how many people graduate and move on, correct? I notice on the LOA report on page 38, the Cal Grant receipts, that there's as far as percent of increase at the state universities is 8%, and the community colleges 7%, but the private for-profit institutes have increased by 21%. Are we seeing in California more students going into the private for-profit institutions?
Yeah, I have a colleague here who maybe can correct me, but if you look just at what's happening with the private for-profits, the state made some decisions in 13-14 regarding institutions that would be eligible to participate. So you can see the big drop from 12-13 to 13-14. I think this is a sort of quirk of when policy was implemented, that some institutions became ineligible in 13-14 and then became eligible again in 14-15. Because you can see 14-15 is still 800 some slots lower than 13-14.
The reason I brought it up is that last week, Friday, I had the opportunity to talk to a bunch of high school seniors going off to college and where they were going to, because we had them visiting the the Capitol last week, and asked them where they were going. And a number of them were going for the private for-profit, and the issue was that they could get in and out in a guaranteed time. I think what the governor's recognizing is that we are in competition with other institutions to educate a working population. And if people are making a decision on where they're going to go on a guaranteed return. And so I think the governor's movement to actually focus on the outcome is probably a good place to be, because I think we're in a competition. That's why I kind of approve what the governor's doing on that. I think we need to watch it and see where it's going and see if we can continue to make ourselves competitive, because I personally feel that though the privates do a nice job, I also have a lot of strong support for public education. So that's my comments.
All right, thank you. I'd like to welcome the chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, Ms. Skinner. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Singh, did you have a question?
So I think just to echo our chair's concerns, I think where I was coming from is a concern that we were increasing funding, but we weren't necessarily providing a clear roadmap for the institutions. And in that instance, that without providing clear direction on what they're supposed to be hitting, what goals they're supposed to be hitting, and I apologize for coming in late to your presentation. I can understand how you do not want to, direct that money or force them to spend it in certain ways, but I think it should be fairly clear, and it wasn't from the initial budget proposal, what outcomes would be acceptable outside of just increased number of graduates. So, as the LAO gave her presentation, is there any thought as to what other performance measures or guidelines that the administration would also look at, so that the institutions wouldn't, say, be surprised 3 years later saying, hey, you didn't hit this mark, that mark, and that's why we're dialing it back. I know for our caucus, it's, we are seeing a number of people who have been turned away, who fit the 12.5%, the 33% guidelines, and are, have hit that target, but are being turned away from these institutions. So I'm sure you can understand why we're so concerned that while we're fully supportive of increasing funding this year, we have a lot of folks who aren't able to enter into those institutions and are being turned away. And as we're increasing funding, it's hard to tell those families why.
Well, for one thing, the universities at their disposal can decide on their own to increase enrollments, right? They can use this 142. I think CSU's made it quite clear that they're going to try to increase enrollments. UC is still trying to increase its enrollments to speed up the enrollment target at UC Merced. So I don't think there's any likelihood that the universities are going to be cutting back on enrollments. But again, that's kind of the idea behind these sustainability plans is, we're giving you $142 million this year and 4% in the next 2 years. Show us what you're going to do with that money. And part of that is we've got these performance measures that are already approved by the legislature and the administration. One, set goals for how quickly you think you can attain some of these measures, and then two, they'll be reporting on them. So that can be part of the budget hearing discussion in the spring. If the legislature feels like, you know, their targets aren't high enough, or they haven't, you know, the administration will obviously weigh in as well. But if we don't think the targets or their outcomes in achieving those targets are what the state should be getting for its money, then the money that's tied to the segments in the following years can be a source of discussion.
As just a separate question on the proposal also, you set aside more money for these innovation grants, which I think I'm supportive of. I was curious why you decided to set up a separate grant proposal process rather than trying to identify programs that have already been successful, have track records of success, and just not funding them. And the reason I ask that is my concern with the grant proposal process is that you're going to get a lot of proposals from the areas that have already sort of ramped up in these areas, and some of the more rural or less urban areas aren't really going to be applying for these types of grants, versus if you actually targeted geographically or by region, or you actually identified programs that have already been successful, that you could be a little more targeted and probably have a broader diversity of funding.
I think part of the idea is, for one, these models that the applications will be based on have to be a new proposal. So it can't be something that the institutions are already doing, right? They could have, it could be in the works or whatever, but they have to show steps they've made in the upcoming year toward putting that model of education, whatever, in place. Our concern is that so many of these decisions are made by individual campuses. So we felt like trying to encourage the campuses among the segments to work together. We're trying to get away from UC and CSU and the community colleges kind of each do their own thing, and I think we've made a lot of progress in terms of them coordinating a lot better. And I think you'll hear comments in the next panel from the three leaders working together to try to achieve some of we all have the same state goals, right? Educating students, getting students into the workforce. But I think we want the campuses to put their heads together and try to think of new ways, again, that'll, increase the number of degrees, that'll allow more students to be enrolled at the beginning.
Okay.
Sorry, just one more question for LAO. So you had pointed out the chart around the fee increases. I was wondering if the office had ever done analysis that if we had just done a 2% increase annually starting in whatever year that chart started, where would we be today relative to where we are? Part of my concern with starting from this point and starting to do inflationary increases is that the huge spikes that fees have gone up over the last 5-10 years has been pretty exorbitant. So where would we be if we had started in 1985 and just grown 2%?
Yeah, we'd be happy to do it and give it to your office. If I can make just maybe a final comment, I know you're about ready to move on, because you've been asking some terrific questions in terms of what's the legislature's role, what kind of control should you have, what decisions should be within your purview. And as you move forward throughout the spring, I think many people care ultimately about both inputs and outputs. They care about, is there a slot for a qualified student to go to UC and CSU? They care about, is the door open for eligible folks? And then they care about how well the universities are serving them. Are they getting through, getting the classes they need, actually getting a degree? Are they able to afford it? We struggled quite a bit because we were asked to look, should the state depart from the traditional model? Should it have a performance-based model? And whereas it's quite straightforward to say, we're taking students, they cost so much money, inflation is so much, faculty salaries et al. Are so much, it's very straightforward to build an input budget. it's not at all straightforward to build a performance budget. So CSU's graduation rate goes up. Is that worth more or less money to you? And then you get into this conversation, oh, incentives, if we give them more money for doing worse, is that the right approach? We struggled with a lot of different performance. Well, could we have points associated with it? The governor tried that last year, and within a very quick amount of time, we were all 1/7 of that. How many points would mean how many dollars? It's really important to consider as part of your budget conversation. It's much less straightforward what you do with the performance results. Again, we'd encourage you to embed it in your budget conversation, but then it's going to be tricky to figure out exactly what to do with it from a finance perspective.
Thank you. We are, we want to make sure we have enough time for our special guests, but if it's a quick question, yes, Mr. Drobny.
So I want to applaud the governor for obviously his overarching goals of affordability and access and increasing the transfer and graduation rates. My question focused on the community college system. Obviously, with increased Prop 98 revenues coming in, we have a great opportunity to really reinvest in the community colleges. I know the governor's proposal includes significant funding increases for 2 categorical programs, student services and also the physical plant operations, but leaves a lot of other important student services without any increases of funding. Obviously, we have an important, I think, choices to make going forward. Can you elaborate a little bit, and I know we have a short amount of time, on why some of these other programs didn't get extra funding? As I see it from my community's point of view, the community colleges, I think, are in the most dire situation of all the systems right now. I think when you look at the cuts as they take effect on the UC and the Cal State system, I think it all comes to a head at the community college system. And I can tell you, they're no longer 2-year colleges. I mean, these become 3 and 4 and unfortunately 5-year colleges. And students, unfortunately, are having to make very difficult decisions whether they stay in school or go back to work and without a college degree. So can you just elaborate very quickly on why the choice with those 2 categorical programs got funding increases and others didn't?
I'm really glad you asked, because I think there is some kind of misunderstanding about how this $200 million for student success is going to work. Rather than providing additional money to each of the categorical programs, right, the disabled students and education opportunity and CalWORK students and whatnot, we're saying each campus has a different set of students, right? They have different needs. They're approaching their programs for these students the best way they can. So rather than focusing on how much the state should be providing for each of these categoricals, we're saying, okay, here's $100 million in the Student Success Program, which we want you to use to address the needs of those specific students that are in these categorical programs. So it's kind of the $100 million in that student success is kind of an overall bundle of money that local colleges will decide how they should support their categorical student programs.
All right, thank you. This is just the beginning. Ms. Quasbarth, Ms. Kuhn, thank you very much. We look forward to our ongoing conversations on higher education. Thank you for coming out. All right, next I would like to invite to the witness, I still say witness stand, witness desk, our very special guests today. We have the special privilege of having 3 of our higher education segments all present here today. And so we would like to invite Janet Napolitano, President of the University of California, Timothy White, Chancellor of California State University, and Bryce Harris, Chancellor of California Community Colleges, to please come forward. Madam President, Chancellors, welcome to Sacramento. In the interest of time, I'd like to propose to the subcommittee that that we allow the 3 heads of their respective segments to give their comments first, and that we group our questions after all three have had a chance to speak. And so with that, why don't we start with our University of California president, Ms. Napolitano. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's a pleasure to be before this group today to discuss some of the policy and budget issues facing the University of California and indeed higher education in the state of California. I'm pleased to be here with my colleagues, Chancellor White from the California State University System and Chancellor Harris from the California Community College System, to discuss with this committee common and collaborative issues facing California public higher education today. I'll try to keep my remarks brief to allow time for my colleagues to address the committee and also to enable the members to have time for questions. Many of you are aware that we've done a similar presentation before the UC Board of Regents in January, and we will be doing a joint presentation before each of the respective boards in the near future. The UC Regents relayed to us their concerns regarding affordability, student access, maintaining educational quality, and the transparency and the ease of transfer between and among the three systems, particularly with respect between the community college systems and the UC. On this issue, one of my first acts as the new UC president was to create a community college transfer initiative. We have an action team that has developed a wide range of strategies, including increasing community outreach to community colleges, campus outreach to community colleges, streamlining the transfer admission process, expanding transfer transition programs such as Summer Bridge, enhancing the racial, ethnic, economic, geographic, and institutional diversity of community college transfer students. And we are now embarked in the process through several different subcommittees of putting together a work plan moving forward with the idea that the master plan in California really contemplates the three legs working together to provide the maximum and opportunity for our young people. They will continue and give us a report by, hopefully by the end of this month. We will do a presentation to the Board of Regents at the May meeting. In addition to this area of collaboration, we have discussed amongst the three of us possible other collaborations, expanding outreach and college awareness for California students as young as 7th graders. What we mean by that is making sure that our young people really understand the accessibility and almost expectation of a higher education in the state of California. Controlling growth and the costs of instruction by collaborating on administrative efficiencies and, where possible, strategic sourcing and procurement to reduce our collective costs of goods and services. So I'll defer to my colleagues to address some of these efforts. Let me turn briefly to the UC budget and provide some insight on the challenges we face. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Governor and the Department of Finance for proposing a multi-year funding plan to reinvest in the University of California and to provide predictability in state funding after 5 long years of state budget reductions. For many years, every 6 months, UC faced dramatic changes in state funding depending on the overall fiscal condition of California. This usually resulted in additional budget cuts, making it difficult for our campuses, our students and their families, and others within the UC community to plan appropriately. Today, campuses are once again able to hire faculty, plan course sections and classes, and to some extent address salary, pension, and health benefit concerns of our employees. The reinvestment by the Governor and the Legislature has also enabled a tuition freeze for the last 2 years. I have already announced I will not seek a tuition increase in the 2014-15 academic year. However, the multi-year funding plan was developed when the state was facing a $26 billion structural deficit, and the voters had just passed Proposition 30. Thankfully, we now see the state may have a $6 billion budget surplus or greater if future revenue assumptions by the LAO are correct. In the case of the University of California, we see this as an opportunity for the governor and for this legislature to provide funding above the multi-year plan in order to address student access and reinvest in academic quality. This idea was represented in Speaker Perez's blueprint for a responsible budget in December. We welcomed this approach to serve more California residents, hire more faculty, offer more breadth and depth in our curriculum, and address the critical need to reinvest in academic quality. The university believes the state has the ability to reinvest some modest ongoing revenue for UC and also to provide some one-time funding that will not overcommit limited state funding and that could be considered on an annual basis. The ongoing funding would support a 1% increase in enrollment, about 2,200 students, address graduate student support needs, and fund the state share of the employer contribution to the UC retirement program. One-time funding would assist the university in the areas that are generally the first to suffer budget reductions and the last to be restored: instructional equipment replacement, library material, instructional technology, and deferred maintenance. One-time funding would also be beneficial to meet some of UC's capital facility needs on a pay-as-you-go plan and reduce the cost of borrowing for our campuses. I want the committee to understand UC is not asking the state to fully fund the Regent's $383 million budget plan. UC will find one-third of this funding on its own through alternative revenue sources, such as increased philanthropy and additional cost savings. And we have achieved those cost savings through the Working Smarter initiatives and by continued efficiency review. For 2014-15, for example, I have instituted a cap on funding for the Office of the President that effectively constitutes a 6.5% further budget reduction on our administrative costs. So we are willing to do our part. We're simply asking the legislature in this economic time to consider doing more. Finally, let us be able to continue on a strong foundation of access and affordability. Here are a few facts that I have found in my travels around California are not commonly understood. More than one-half of our students pay no tuition because of the robust financial aid program the state, the federal government, and the university provide. About half of UC's 2012 graduating undergraduates had no student loan debt, and the 50% who did borrow had average debt well below the national average of $25,000 for other public four-year institutions. As a result of our aid programs, as well as admissions policies that account for the special challenges facing disadvantaged students, UC has a higher percentage of Pell Grant recipients, 42%, than at any comparable public or private institution, with an average of 23% and 18%, respectively, if their undergraduate populations were considered low income. Finally, let me respond to the LAO recommendation to the legislature as they pertain to our budget. Clearly, we agree with the overall approach of the LAO to provide funding that will meet our mandatory costs for the UCRP and retiree health benefits. We also support the concept of share of cost for students and their families to support the UC budget, though not as part of the 14-15 budget. I've been working with my staff on a long-term tuition and financial aid plan similar to the LAO approach, and will consult widely with UC stakeholders, the governor, and the legislature before the regents adopt any future recommendations. There is one particular area of concern I'd like to close with related to the LAO enrollment funding recommendation. UC has been a good citizen of the state of California. We took our share of recent budget cuts without reducing our commitment to enrollment under the master plan. What that means is that we currently now serve 7,500 students for whom the state has not provided funding, at a cost of roughly $75 million. We are hopeful that the legislature will recognize and reward UC's commitment to student access by supporting our request for enrollment funding. Providing sufficient support to offer the life-changing benefits a UC education provides, providing support for the collaborative efforts among the 3 institutions of higher learning in California. This is a solid investment in our state's future. Mr. Chairman, that completes my testimony.